Hi everybody, my name is Rhonda Thompson. I am part of the Black History Manitoba Celebration Committee here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And I am just here to wish you guys a happy Black History Month, and to also let you know that I know that usually we would be able to have our story times in person during the month of February, but this year, because we can't, we decided to bring them to you virtually. So normally we'd be sitting in the Winnipeg Public Library all joined together, and this year we are going to be bringing it to you one-on-one. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy. So today the book that we've decided on is the book on Ruby Bridges. So those of you that don't know who she is, I hope by the end of the story you'll have learned something great. And if you're ever doing a history project and you wanted to use maybe a not so well-known figure, but that has done some amazing things, she would be one. So let's get into the story of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. "We were very poor, very, very poor," Ruby said. "My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat, and the people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy had lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think." There she is. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor, and her mother took care of the children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. "We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit," Ruby's mother said, "and we wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start." At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was actually against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black children to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. Ruby's parents were very proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. "We sat there and prayed to God," Ruby's mother said, "that we'd all be strong, that we'd have courage, and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all Americans. We prayed long and we prayed hard." Even the whole family there. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people were carrying signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to even hurt her. The city and state police did nothing to help her. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building, and the marshals carried guns. Imagine having to go through all that just to go to school. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked into the Frantz school surrounded by marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men, women, and children all shouting at her. They pushed towards her, and the marshals kept them from Ruby, threatening them to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a single word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. So when Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and to learn with, and to even eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building. "Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it," said Mrs. Henry. "How she went by those mobs and sat all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable." Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk towards the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women, and she seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened, and they tried to persuade Ruby to move along, and they tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened, and Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her, and this morning she had forgotten until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for that day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual, and after she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she'd repeated twice a day before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." And that ends the story of Ruby Bridges. But there is an afterword that I wanted to share with you guys, just so you guys get a little bit more information about Ruby Bridges and her story. So later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the Friends Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The mob became very angry when the first white students went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. "We've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the laws into their own hands," one parent said. "And it's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's rights to go to a school and get their education." They all did get their education, Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls who went to school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's orders that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to French school, and she graduated from there and then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby is now married, and she has 4 sons, and she's a successful businesswoman, and she's created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation. With its focus on education, community, and the future of our nation's children, the foundation is especially dedicated to revitalizing the school that she went to, which is located in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. Ruby is once again stepping to the forefront and embracing opportunities to make history by contributing to the challenge that their nation is facing in the recovery efforts following the Hurricane Katrina. And there is also a special exhibit featuring her story at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis in Indianapolis, Indiana, called "The Power of Children, Making a Difference." So I encourage you all to get out there and make everyone proud and make great strides in order to identify what their struggles might be within your community and lend a hand to people when they need it, and get out there and learn something new about somebody this month. So I thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.